Hey y'all, hi. So the published date of my book is right around the corner, March 12th, and I'm back with some information about the shipping of the pre-orders, availability of the book after its actual published date, and some information about the book itself, preparing to read the book itself. If you aren't caught up, then watch the video in which I announce the book and talk about my history as a writer, how it came about that it's being published, etc. I will link that in the cards and in the description box down below. But I think most of you are caught up. So let's get right into the meat of the video. Okay, I have some notes, but I'm also kind of winging it, and I hope this video won't end up being like an hour and a half long, because when I start talking about poetry, let me tell you. First things first, though, the published date is March 12th, and on that day, the book will be available again to buy on the Waywiser site. That's the publisher's site. And it should also be available at online bookshops. I think it will be available on Amazon on March 12th. I'll double check that and confirm in a pinned comment. But if you didn't happen to pre-order and you still want to buy the book, it'll be easy to buy it on March 12th. If you're one of the people who signed up to be notified when the book was available in the European Union, and you didn't happen to see the email that I sent letting you know that Waywiser had actually figured out how to ship to the European Union and reopened pre-orders for the European Union, that happened like a week or two after the original pre-order window. A lot of you in the EU did get that memo and did place a pre-order. But if you didn't, don't worry, you can still order from Waywiser actually after March 12th. Even if you're in the European Union, and they will ship to you. They figured out how to make it work. Look though, I already have mine. They're already printed. So Waywiser sent me a box of books. This is what it looks like. It's a pretty slender volume. I'm really about quality over quantity in poetry as well. It's been very exciting, thrilling, and as ever, surreal to have this lying around the house. I have some information for those of you who did pre-order the book. And to those of you who did, thank you so much. I cannot wait for these books to start making their way out into the world to you, but it's going to happen kind of over a long period of time because it's such a small press. It's not just that Waywiser is itself a small press, it's that poetry presses are very small. And just poetry publishing in general is not used to the volume of orders actually that Waywiser is having to handle because so many of you bought books, which is extraordinary. It's spectacular. All of us agree that it's spectacular, but the system isn't designed to handle it. So it means that unlike maybe bigger publishing houses or, makeup brands that are used to shipping lots and lots of palettes right after a palette launches, for example, it's like they can only pack so many orders at once, and they are already doing it. But it's taking weeks to pack them all up, and then when it's time to start shipping them out, they can only take so many packages a day to the post office. The post office can only handle so many packages a day. So they're going to have to go out in waves. And because of that, Waywiser is going to start shipping the books before March 12th. And some of you are going to get them before March 12th. So you're going to receive your books like a week or two in advance of when it's actually technically published. Probably the UK. Let me check the email. Yeah, so I'm filming this on a Wednesday. Philip says that he is going to start mailing the UK orders out beginning on Friday. So probably by the time this video goes up, you might have a book in your mailbox if you're in the UK. And then the EU orders will be next after that, and they will probably be the soonest to arrive after that because of proximity. And Philip says, once they are dispatched, I plan to turn to the rest of the orders, those going to the US and the rest of the world, but I can see all of this taking some time. So it's to be expected that a good many orders won't reach their customers until after March 12th. So basically between now, which is the middle of February, between now and the middle of March, all of the books are going to go out in waves, ending with the United States and the rest of the world. And some of those might lag a little bit after the published dates. So if you pre-ordered, don't be surprised or alarmed if your book arrives early. But most importantly, if you start seeing other people receiving their book and you haven't received yours, don't stress out about it. It could be, it looks like as much as a month in between when the very first customers in the UK receive their orders and the very final round of shipping gets actually dispatched and lands where it's supposed to land, which shouldn't be too long after March 12th. But it is unusual for something to launch and to take a number of weeks to ship everywhere. Sometimes things will take there will be a lag of days from the time that the first orders go out to the time the last orders go out. But because this is such a tiny operation, operation and they're handling so many more times the number of books at one time that they're used to handling, it's going to be a matter of weeks. Because you are all so great, so understanding, and handled it with such aplomb when the pre-orders broke the site because of this same issue. Everyone was so good-natured and understanding about that, and I expect you will all be good-natured and understanding about this too. I'm not worried, but I wanted to give you all of the information so that you would have it. Okay, that's everything about the logistics of the launch. Let's talk a little bit about poetry and a little bit about the poems in the book, actually. So there's this thing about poetry, this question of how much do you have to know in order to connect with a given poem? So for example, the poem by Christina Rossetti, "Who has seen the wind? Neither I nor you. But when the leaves hang trembling, the wind is passing through. Who has seen the wind? Neither you nor I. But when the trees bow down their heads, the wind is passing by." To connect with that poem, you need to know what the wind is, and that's kind of it. Like every poem of substance, the more you read it, and the more times you read it in your life, the more it weaves itself through the experience of your life, and the more that you live in the world, the more the poem will offer to you, right? It will open itself to you, unfolding, and layers will emerge. And I don't mean layers of hidden meaning that you unlock with a key if you know what to look for with your brain. I mean the felt sense of the poem will kind of melt together with you, with your life experience, and a third thing will grow. So the poem offers itself to you, you offer yourself to the poem, you make it part of your life, and it's like watering a flower. It grows, it unfolds, it blooms for you inside of your life, inside of yourself, inside of your body, kind of. This is just to say that there are layers of different kinds of meaningfulness to you that could reveal themselves to you in that poem over the course of your life and your time with it. But to connect with it just the first time, all the information that you need is what is wind? What does the word wind mean? That's a piece of information that most people have before they are even verbal. You know what I mean? That is information that you've had your whole life. I can already tell I'm not going to manage to be as concise as I would like to be. Bear with me. It's this catch-22 that happens, right? I don't have enough time to prep an extremely streamlined essayistic video. So I just jot down some notes and then I wing it on camera, and that makes the video much longer and it takes longer to edit. So it bites us in the butt on the back end. But I think for this one, it's the only way. I'll try to make some more organized and concise videos about poetry, but this is what we're doing today. So with some poems, the answer to the question, how much do you need to know to connect to the poem, is very little. You need to know very little, and the thing that you need to know, or the things you need to know, are things that everybody knows. But in some cases, a poem contains references, and those references can be anything from words that you might not know the definition of, through to very specific references to something in the world. References that, if you know them, they will enhance your experience of reading the poem in a distinct way. So for example, there is this famous Imagist poem by William Carlos Williams, "This Is Just to Say." You might have heard of it. The poem goes, "I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox, and which you were probably saving for breakfast. Forgive me, they were delicious, so sweet, and so cold." It's a poem in the style of a note left on the kitchen counter. William Carlos Williams is into this thing of saying this can be a poem. At the time, it was sort of calling into question, what is a poem? William Carlos Williams, by the way, was a doctor. Did you know that? William Carlos Williams was a doctor writing poetry on the side, and Wallace Stevens was an insurance agent, and T.S. Eliot was a banker. It is with this information that I comfort myself when I wake up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat thinking, what am I doing reviewing makeup on YouTube when I'm actually trying to write poetry with my life? I take a deep breath and I say to myself, Hannah, William Carlos Williams was a doctor, Wallace Stevens was an insurance agent, and T.S. Eliot was a banker. And then I go back to sleep. Anyway, This Is Just to Say by William Carlos Williams, the note on the kitchen counter poem. It was written in the mid-30s. And then in the early 2000s, a poet named Kenneth Koch wrote a poem called Variations on a Theme by William Carlos Williams. And it's like a joke on the other poem. Kenneth Koch's poem goes, I chopped down the house that you had been saving to live in next summer. I am sorry, but it was morning and I had nothing to do, and its wooden beams were so inviting. Last evening we went dancing and I broke your leg. Forgive me, I am clumsy and I wanted you here in the wards where I am the doctor. So this is a case in which knowing not just William Carlos Williams's poem, this is just to say, knowing how it unfolds, but also knowing a little bit of the history, knowing that that was kind of a pivotal poem in the Imagist movement, knowing that it's such a famous poem. It lets you in on the wink, wink, nudge, nudge of what Kenneth Koch was doing. Koch's poem is a response, a twist. We all wanted a twist, eh? It's like a twist on this other famous poem. So when you're talking about Kenneth Koch's poem and you're asking the question of how much you need to know, well, it just helps tremendously to have this information about the William Carlos Williams poem when you're reading the other one. Now, there are a lot of poems in my book, in Julia Hungry, that do not rest in any way upon a piece of pre-existing information, upon another poem, upon the history of poetry. There are a lot of poems in here that don't do anything close to what Kenneth Koch was doing. But there are a handful of them that do something akin to variations on a theme. I've been reading poetry since I was really young. It was really poems themselves, in a way, individual poems themselves that pulled me into poetry. Not like the idea of poetry itself or the idea of being a poet, but these individual poems that I've read so many times since I was so young that they're like in my bones. Like it feels like the poems are part of my actual physical body. There's kind of artistic, spiritual muscle memory. And in addition to a lot of other things that I've explored as a writer, I have explored writing kind of in conversation with some of these poems that are so dear to me and poets whose work I know so closely. As I would say an apprentice to those poets in my own way, and also as a young woman or as a person who started out, like when I first started doing this as I was a young woman, and then the process stretched over many years and I'm no longer that young of a woman, but as a young woman kind of pushing her own thoughts and experiences into these magnificent structures, these forms of these poems created by old men, basically. Not in a purely adversarial way, but in a way that kind of mixes passion and genuine respect with frustration and a sense of being not allowed access, like a sense of being boxed out. As the book description says on the website, part love affair and part fencing match with these forms. Now, I cannot express this with enough vigor. I strongly believe that a poem should stand alone. I want you to be able to read a poem and commune with it and get into it, even if there happen to be references in it with which you're not familiar. And in the case of the Kenneth Koch, I actually think the language and the imagery are clear enough, the tone is strong enough, and you could even read it and find it funny, and it could maybe even stick in your head and become like a touchstone for your own life, even if you don't know the literary context of the original poem by W.C. Williams. It's nice to know the context. It does shed a pretty strong light on the Kenneth Koch poem to know the context, but it's not nothing without it. It doesn't offer you nothing without it. It's kind of like song sampling. So for example, A Tribe Called Quest sampling Walk on the Wild Side in Can I Kick It? You know, the beginning of Can I Kick It? I don't need to sing it for you to know what I'm talking about. Can I Kick It samples Walk on the Wild Side. And knowing the reference, like catching the reference, illuminates how brilliant and how truly innovative Tribe was. And it adds a wonderful nuance, especially if you're thinking with your intellectual mind about the song. Like if you're spending brain time with the song. But not knowing it, like not knowing Walk on the Wild Side or not catching the reference when you listen to Can I Kick It, not catching it in no way hinders your relationship as a listener with Can I Kick It? In a vacuum, the vacuum of not knowing about the sampling, Can I Kick It is just as catchy, just as gripping, just as delightful, and just as available to you as a listener. It is still fully available to you. And that is what I want for my poems, even the ones that are descendants, so to speak, of other poems. So if you get the book, if you get Julia Hungry, I want you to feel free to dive in without feeling worried about what you don't know or what you think you might need to know in order to connect with these poems. Because just as in the case of Who Has Seen the Wind, Neither I Nor You, but when the leaves hang trembling, the wind is passing through, the poems will make themselves available to you with their own words, with words that you can understand in some way. At least that is my hope. And that's one of the things that I've thought a lot about as a poet over the last few decades. And it's one of the things that I thought a lot about when I was putting this book together. Some of the poems in the book are as referential as Variations on a Theme by William Carlos Williams, I Chopped Down the House That You Were Planning to Live In Next Summer, as referential as that. But my hope is that they are also as available to you as Who Has Seen the Wind, Neither I Nor You. You don't need a primer. You don't need to do advanced research to read Julia Hungry. However, for those of you who have an interest, I want to pave the way for Julia Hungry for you by tipping you off in advance about some of the poems that it is built upon, so to speak. So I'm going to tell you what they are now so that you can go and read them if you want to, and then see what I've done with them when Julia Hungry arrives. So for the rest of this video, I'm just going to tell you about these 5 poems that you might enjoy reading, and that if you do read, you will have as lenses when you read my book, as I did when I wrote my book. But first, a word about reading poetry. If you can print them out, I'm going to link these poems below. If you can print them out. Because having poetry as a solid, as a physical object, I think does make a difference. If you can't, or if it doesn't make sense to you, then have them on your phone, and that's totally fine. Better to read them on your phone than not at all. But I know that a lot of us, even those of us who love poetry, have a little bit of a funny relationship with it. It's like it feels like jumping into a cold pond or getting into a cold shower to pick up a poem and start reading it. It can feel like a little bit of a pushing through of a membrane. And if it's on your phone, if that's where you're accessing it, the temptation to scroll to something else on your phone, to access something else, to pull yourself away from the poem will be great. Whereas if you have it physically and it's the only object in your hand, you'll stay in it more easily. You'll stay with it more easily. The physicality will help you. So what I suggest is, if you're into it, printing out these 5 poems and then taking each one and putting it somewhere physically in your life that you frequent. So if you make coffee or tea in your kitchen twice a day, then put one of them like next to the coffee grinder. I would say put one of them in the bathroom, like put one of them on the back of the toilet, so it's waiting for you there. Maybe put one on your bedside table. Maybe put one in your bag, like put one in your purse, so that when you're on the bus or you're waiting in line somewhere, instead of pulling out your phone, you can pull out this poem. Just put them around and then live your life as you live it and read the poems as you go through your day, idly and in a low pressure way, and over again. Just like listening to a song on repeat. When you put on a song, you're not putting pressure on yourself to arrive at your final relationship with that song on this listening. It's like, you might listen to it. You will listen to it again and again and again in your life. So this is just this experience. You're just in it now and you're open when you listen to a song. Read them like that. Just don't ask anything of yourself except for that you're reading the poem again. And just, it's fine. The words flow in one ear and out the other. Maybe you read it out loud. The words are in the chamber of your chest and come out of your mouth and echo in the house and then fade into silence. And that's it. And if you end up having thoughts about the content, that's fine. But I would say try to let the poems engage your ear and your heart primarily. If you so choose, they can also engage the mind. And I find I mean, this is how I read poems, right? I read with the ear and the heart first, and I will often read a poem as if I'm listening to a song, like 10 times over the course of a few weeks before it even occurs to me what it's about. I will literally block out what I think it might be trying to say or whatever, and just listen and absorb orally, heart-wise, over and over and over as much as I can before I let the mind engage and let its gears start turning. But what I find is that eventually the mind will engage, and in sort of an unexpected way. And I'm not saying you should not let that happen. It's just that if you try to use only the mind, if you try to read these poems that I'm suggesting that you might read, if you try to read them with only your mind, then there's a chance that you and the poem will kind of box each other out It'll be more like a grappling than a mingling. And what I'm hoping that you will do is mingle with these poems, because that is how it's been for me. Just like I was talking about earlier in the video, the poems in my bones, like in the soil from which I grew, the soil from which the book grew. And I also don't want to stress you out. I mean, reading poems, for a lot of people, it comes with the pressure of school, but this has nothing to do with that. You're not in school. This isn't school. I mean, maybe you are in school, but we're not having school right now. It's not about achieving anything, you know? It's really about relaxing the boundaries around the heart and letting the poems in like a scent, letting them into your body, into your home, like music, and just abiding with them. Because there are consequences of that. There are joys associated with that practice that you never learned about in school. Okay, the poems themselves that I suggest that you read. The first one is called Archaic Torso of Apollo, and it was written around the turn of the century by the Austrian poet Rainer Maria Rilke. It was originally written in German. I don't speak German. If you do, by all means, read it in German. But I really love this translation by Stephen Mitchell, and that's the English language translation that I will link down below. Archaic Torso of Apollo is about standing in front of a sculpture, the torso of Apollo, only the torso, beholding this piece of ancient art and being beheld by it. We cannot know his legendary head. This is the Stephen Mitchell translation. We cannot know his legendary head with eyes like ripening fruits, because it's just the torso. We cannot know his legendary head with eyes like ripening fruits, and yet his torso is still suffused with brilliance from within, like a lamp in which his gaze, now turned to low, still gleams with all its power. And this poem, at least the Stephen Mitchell translation, famously ends with this 5 single-syllable word sentence: "You must change your life." It's short, quick read, and if I get into how I feel about all of these poems, we will be here forever. So let's move on to the next one. In Memory of W.B. Yeats, an elegy written by W.H. Auden for Yeats after he died. This was written in the late 30s, I believe. Yeats died at the end of that decade, and I assume that the poem was written right after that. It's in 3 parts, and each part is metrically different. That's one of the interesting things about this poem to keep an eye out for if that interests you. But again, you can just read it through. Let it wash over you and listen to how it sounds. I think knowing that it's an elegy helps in the case of this poem. This poem also contains one of Auden's most famous lines, much quoted, although out of context: "Poetry makes nothing happen." All right, poem number 3 for you, and maybe the most fun, Bagpipe Music by Louis MacNeice, also written at the end of the 1930s. This is a rollicking, humorous poem about the cultural implications of modernization. I think what at that time was called industrialized society, but it was like the late 1930s version of what we now call late stage capitalism. Back then, it was like, what's happening to the world? I mean, in the words of the poem, it's no go the merry-go-round, it's no go the rickshaw, all we want is a limousine and a ticket for the peep show. Or possibly my favorite part, it's no go the yogi man, it's no go Blavatsky, all we want is a bank balance and a bit of skirt and a taxi. It was like MacNeice's grim, humorous take on what was going on, what was being lost or erased by the wave of newness, what people were wanting now, craving now, instead of what they used to want and crave. I mean, I'm not going to go on, I think, about it, because it's just like with every poem, it's so much more than the sum of its parts. It's way more than what I could summarize it as being. And at the same time, it just only is what it is. You know, it's like, it is just itself. And reading it is, the experience of reading it is all that I want for you. I want that for you, not hearing me talk about it. But I'm trying to give you some context so that it won't be so unfamiliar or jarring. Like, I'm just trying to give you a little bit of an entree into the poem. It's particularly fun to read because of its rollicking beat and silly rhymes. And then it gets kind of dark at the end, you know, of course. Okay, next up, I Knew a Woman by Theodore Roethke, written in the mid-50s. I knew a woman lovely in her bones when small birds sighed. she would sigh back at them, etc., etc. A clever, sexy love poem full of double entendres. I think you'll like it. And then lastly, another poem by Rilke, and I will offer you the Stephen Mitchell translation of this one as well, Orpheus, Eurydice, Hermes. This is a long poem, also written around the turn of the century, and it is simply Rilke's telling of the part of the Orpheus myth where he goes underground to retrieve Eurydice, is walking back out of the underworld towards the world and turns around. And I'll link, the Wikipedia page about the Orpheus and Eurydice myth. And that's actually a poem for which it helps to know the myth. And then to read my poem, it helps to know both the myth and the poem. Although I love the idea of somebody reading it without knowing any of those things. I love the idea of someone reading Orpheus, Eurydice, Hermes without knowing the context of the myth. And I think it's still rich. And I hope that it's still available, that there's a lot that's still available to you without the context. But either way, what a glorious poem, Rilke's Orpheus, Eurydice, Hermes. It's long and narrative and full of imagery and deeply evocative. That's it. I've got to go. I'm overwrought. I am been filming for an hour, sweating. I'm very, very, very excited about all of this. And I hope that you will enjoy spending time with these 5 poems, little gems that will give you a particular kind of context for some of what I have been doing all of these years. Context which is, I can't stress this enough, not necessary to have to read the book, but might be enjoyable to have, might enhance your experience to have if pursuing the context, familiarizing yourself with these poems, welcoming them into your life, if that sounds like something you would like to do. Again, thank you so much to everyone who ordered the book. I cannot wait to do a little bit more of this with you. What a joy. Just a pure joy in the midst of everything right now. Thank you as well for watching. And don't forget to take extra good care of yourself so that you can be the most effective version of yourself as you do your work in the world. Okay, I think we got it.